So with that, I am going to turn it over to Craig, who is going to talk about advanced Puppet design. And this is Craig, not Greg, for those of you that saw the typo on the agenda.
Is this coming out too loud, or is it all right? Can you hear me? Yeah? Nope. Apparently not. Is that better? Awesome. Thanks. Hi. So, welcome to my talk. A little bit about me before we get started. So, my name's Craig Dunn. As Dawn pointed out, that's with a C, not a G. I've been a Puppet user since about 2008. Previously worked for Puppet Labs, so awesome company to work for. I think Andy said this morning that they're hiring. They're always hiring. But these days, I'm a sort of more of a freelance automation engineer and trainer through my company, Enviatics. I'm based out in Spain, but there's not a lot of work there, so I tend to work everywhere apart from Spain. So what I'm going to talk about today, I was originally going to call this the roles and profiles talk, but Puppet design is about a lot more than just the roles and the profiles. So we are going to talk about that, but we're also going to talk about writing good modules and how to overcome some of the challenges of code-based design in Puppet. But before we get into that, so raise your hand if you've developed a code base, a Puppet code base in the past. I was hoping that more than one would put the hand up. And keep your hand up if you've had to go back from scratch and rewrite it again. It's almost the same number who put their hands up. Awesome. So what I'm trying to cover is ways of thinking that in the future you won't have to hit that step where you then have to go back and rewrite everything because stuff doesn't fit. So the first exercise is to try and think properly about what we're trying to do. So your business will come to you with requirements, and we're going to use technology to fulfill those requirements. That's great. But it's not that simple. And what we see a lot is the business logic, so how the business sees our infrastructure and sees the services, doesn't align with the actual technological design. So, for instance, your manager comes up to you, we have a business requirement of 3 applications that we want to deploy with Puppet. And that's cool, because we do Puppet. So we go off and Puppetize. And the first thing we do is say, OK, the business asked for 3 applications, so I'm going to write 3 Puppet modules. Because that was the requirement, wasn't it? Or was it? So what you might find is, a little bit down the line, things are starting to not work very well. And you're starting to figure out, you're starting to think why you're trying to drive that square peg through the round hole. So as an example, let's suppose that what the business is calling an application is just a shared set of components, and they're just implemented a different way. So that's what they really are. So now we start to see a bit of a difference between what the business see, which is correct from their point of view, but the technical reality of these 3 applications is that there's much more overlap. So we can't just think about it as 3 applications. Some of the danger signs that you'll start to see creeping into your code. And so resources being declared in 2 modules, that's probably one of the most classic ones. If you can't really put your finger on it, but you just don't know how your implementation fits. So you've written all these modules, and it's like, well, how do I glue all this stuff together? How do I make it work? Logic at a node level, I'm going to talk about a bit more in a minute, but it's basically saying, for every node I've got, I care about lots of little things about it. Repetition and duplication, so if you're starting to cut and paste, that's bad. And if you start solving every problem with the if statement, you're probably running into bigger problems. There's then a couple of things which I like to think of more as catastrophic signs. So if you start to have code like this creeping into your manifests, if you're making decisions based on what the regex of a host name is, this is probably not the solution. You want to be looking at things like Huayra and other stuff. And is Felix still in the room who did the talk? Yeah? So Felix should like the last one. So my other catastrophic sign is if defined. Felix talked about this a lot in the talk before last. For all of his reasons, I don't like it as well. You should know within your code base that this package HTTPD is managed by one resource and one resource only. So one resource declaration. So what I don't want is the package HTTPD to be managed, but I don't know where it was managed. And also Felix mentioned what a lot of people think is a solution to this, and it really isn't. It's a little bit nicer because it causes stuff to fail rather than just silently breaking things. But under the hood, if you actually look at the Ruby, it's pretty much just taken the if-defined problem and moved it into Ruby. So after catastrophic signs, I have another class which is world-ending signs. So who here is aware of parser equals future? So parser equals future is fairly new. I can't remember what version it got originally released in. Anybody? 3.3. And the intention, parser equals future unlocks a lot of new and funky cutting-edge syntax that's not normally available in the Puppet language. And the reason Puppet Labs put it out there was so you can experiment with stuff, give them feedback, and collaborate. They didn't put it there so you could solve your production problems. Order equals manifest. I think the community is a little bit split on opinion. I personally think if you're writing modules that depend on order equals manifest, maybe you should go back and look at why you need that. So if any of these danger signs are starting to resonate with you and you recognize any of them, you're going to be on the road very quickly to having an unhappy Puppet. And nobody wants an unhappy Puppet. So what are we going to do about it? First thing, let's stop thinking about what stuff looks like or what people tell us stuff is, and break everything down into individual components. So granularity, I'm going to talk about quite a bit, and that's the key here. And then think about what it actually is you're trying to do, not just how it looks, not how the end result looks. So before we worry about roles, profiles, Huayra, anything else, we want to be writing good modules. And the three mantras I always try and use when writing a module is keep it granular, keep it portable, and let users decide how things get done. So flexibility of implementation. Don't dictate how a module should configure itself. So here's an example of a bad module. So it's not granular, so we're trying to manage the HTTP, the PHP, and the MySQL Server package resources all from this class web. And portability, so at the top we've got lots of hard-coded data that's specific to just our environment. And we're also making assumptions on operating systems, for instance, with the package names and file locations. So this module just isn't implementable. I don't even know if that's a word. So first thing we need to do always is keep our modules granular. If that means you have a lot of modules, that's fine. And if that means you have small modules, that's fine. Keep them granular. So here's an example of a more granular module. So it's getting better. It's granular. We're only managing resources that are directly related to Apache in our class called Apache. But we're still not portable. So we've still got this hard-coded data that's specific to our environment. And so sharing is good. You should always be thinking to write your stuff with the intention of sharing it with others. So not only can you share that within your team, and when we come on to talk about profiles, you can even share it with yourself. You can publish on the Forge, and people will collaborate when you do this. So unless you really like doing all the work yourself, get others to do it, because it's all about sharing. And some people work for organizations where sharing is difficult, where there isn't a culture of contributing back upstream to open source projects, but they're still happy to use free software. And if you're in that kind of organization, you just need to learn to try and delicately persuade people around you that this is a good thing and we should be sharing. So also, when people talk about sharing, they tend to just think about GitHub. And sharing's not just about pull requests. You can share if you don't code. You can share your ideas on blog posts. You can tell the world what worked and what didn't for you, help others. And the same with mailing lists and IRC. So from a Puppet point of view, how do we make sharing easier? So we separate the data from the code using Huayra, and we want to allow the user the flexibility of implementation of our module. So the pattern that gets used for this is the params pattern. The params pattern has been around since pre-Huayra and has sort of evolved and has gone through several iterations. I will probably get shot for it and never use this term again, but I thought I'd throw it out there. I think defaults is a much nicer name. But the idea is the same. So we use a parameterized class, and we default our variables from an inherited class, and we allow the user to decide implementation. So going back to our Apache class, the main problems with this, we've got this in-module private data, and we've got no way to override this. If we turn this into a parameterized class, already we've got a major win. We can have our defaults as a parameterized class, and then users, when they implement our module, can decide either when they declare the class, what they want these values to be, or they can override them in Huayra. But we didn't get much control over our defaults with that pattern, so you can go one step further and create this Apache Defaults. I'll reword it to Apache params if nobody likes it. But this gives us the ability to, within our code, make decisions on what those defaults should be. So not just, don't just default to Apache, default to Apache 2 if we're on Debian. And you'll also notice what I didn't have in there before was IP address and FQDN. So if there are sensible defaults, use them, because the easier you can make it for your users, the better. And then our parameterized class can just inherit from that. And when we refer to these configuration variables within our manifest now, we always refer to the one that's in the base class. We never ever want to be talking to the one in the defaults class, or we'll lose the ability to override that from Huayra. So we've gained three things by just following this kind of pattern. So we got smaller modules with a smaller scope, only managing things that they care about. We've taken out that hard-coded data from modules, and we've made the implementation a lot easier, so our users can decide how and where they want to override. So when we're talking about Puppet design, this is what I like to call our component modules now. So these are the building blocks that we're going to use. And we've got our component modules, and they're cool and they're well written, so it's time to build something awesome now. But where? So how do we piece all this together? Most people who design Puppet follow this kind of stack. So we've developed all these component modules, and then what we call node classification. Node classification is just assigning classes to nodes. So include Apache. The problem with this model, I mentioned node level logic earlier, is that we end up in this kind of mess where for every node we're worrying about the class Apache, we're worrying about the class MOTD, the class SSH. It's a lot. The pattern a lot of people used to overcome this in the very, very old days was node inheritance. And I don't think there's anybody alive who thinks that's a good idea. So you risk duplication and repetition. You don't have any guarantee of consistency because you're just chucking all this data at the node level. And if you are using these pseudo nodes and inheritance trees, it's going to get really messy really fast, and that's why everyone tells you don't ever do it. And so it's too much information at this node layer. So then we start thinking, okay, so Puppet's a code base. It's code, you're writing code. And in any other code base, you have some kind of a framework to develop around, a development framework, and a way to glue everything together in a sensible way. And Puppet's no different. So with Puppet, the first layer that I use in this pattern is profiles. So this is taking all our component modules now and doing something with them. So a profile is effectively a wrapper class implementing those component modules. And we use profiles to define a logical technology stack, emphasis on technology, not business logic. But just one, we don't want to fall into the problem with modules where we're trying to do too much in one place. So a profile should be limited to the things that make up logically that technology stack, not the whole world. So here's a quick example. My profile for blog. There's a couple of interesting things here. So I'm implementing component modules for MySQL and for WordPress to get my blog up and running. I can also do other bits of logic that don't really fit in a module, like realize some user resources. So the component modules manage our resources, and then on top of that now we have this. I'll skip to that one, it's better. On top of the component modules, we now have a profiles layer. And the profiles layer is just dealing with the implementation of stuff below it, and that stuff below it manages all your resources. So there's a couple of lessons we've learned already, and that's granularity is really good. Don't assume that the business logic will align with what you're trying to do. It won't translate into technology. But more importantly, abstraction is really awesome. But it's nothing new. So people have dealt with abstraction in coding forever. People don't implement stuff over and over again. People take the implementation of something and they wrap it in a method. And then those methods they put into classes and abstract them even further. And then they take all those classes and put them into libraries and share them. And Puppet's code, so why shouldn't it be doing the same thing? But it is. Puppet's all about the abstraction. So providers are abstracted by types, and resource declarations are abstracted by classes. And then just like coding, we take classes and we abstract them into modules. So all we're doing with profiles is just going one step further and saying, OK, and those modules are now abstracted by profiles. So focusing on abstraction a little bit. So what we've done so far is we've taken that business logic and we've translated it into what it looks like as a technology stack with profiles. So is there any way we could translate that back into business logic? And why would we want to do that? So this is where roles comes in. So roles aims to translate your technology back the other way into business logic. And we try and use roles to identify the function of a server in human terms, not in technical terms. So I never said that the business logic was a bad thing, and the way the business sees things is not a bad thing. It's a correct thing. It's just you shouldn't take that and just go and dump it into Puppet. But it's a good thing. So I'm bad with naming things. So my ACME server, because that's the most original thing I could think of, my ACME server role is made up not just of blog, but there's other stuff as well. There's a user's profile, there's a networking profile, there's a security profile. So in order to explain this better, let's think about the users. We remember those still, right? So meet John, Susan, and Bill. So John is a sysadmin. He's most likely your sort of hardcore Puppet master. He wants to, it's important for him that all his servers are configured in a certain way, that things like kernel hardening and NTP and SSH are configured. He wants to manage everything, all the packages, all the services, all the resources. Then we have Susan. So Susan's an application specialist. So she's still in the team, she's still important. But as an application specialist, she cares more that this node has WordPress and MySQL implemented properly. She probably doesn't care all that much about sudoers. And then finally, we've got Bill. So Bill's an IT manager, and all he cares about is that this node is an ACME app server. Like, he doesn't even know what sudoers is. So what do these people care about? So John cares about modeling all of the resources. Susan cares about the technology stack, and Bill cares about the business logic. And there's no reason why we can't keep all these three people happy with Puppet. We're already doing that for John. So we're doing the resource modeling in our component layer, with our component modules. The technology stack we've defined in profiles. So that's a perfect space for Susan. That's where the stuff she cares about lives. And so where do we represent this business logic for Bill? So we represent this in roles. So roles represent the business logic, not the technology. They define a set, there could be more than one, a set of technology stacks or profiles that make up what this logical role is. And now we've got a way that the business can manage and they can see how the infrastructure looks and understand it without worrying about actually what it is. So a couple of things with roles. A node can only ever have one role. So if a node needs to be slightly different than its next door neighbor, it's not a combination of roles, it's a new thing. So roles define what things are. So something, for instance, can't be a lion and a kangaroo at the same time. Dawn's smiling because she knows the next slide. It would be a lingaroo. And I've had customers ask me, well, that's great, but we have like loads of edge cases and we've got all these servers and they're all different. Doesn't that mean we're going to have like a ton of roles? And I always say, yeah, you have lots of different types of servers. You have lots of roles. There's nothing wrong with that. So, summing up, roles have a one-to-one relationship with nodes, but a one-to-many with profiles, so a role can include all of the profiles that it needs in order to do its job. And roles are stupid and dumb. The only thing they do is implement profiles, include profiles. They don't have resource declarations. They don't have anything to do with component modules. So if we go back to our stack, we're managing our resource modeling layer with our component modules. We've got profiles providing this implementation layer. And all we've done is add another layer of abstraction now to this, which is roles, in order to expose the business logic of what we're trying to do. So here's an example of a role class. Again, it's dumb. It just includes profiles. And the naming of it, although not very original in my example, represents the business logic of what the function of this server is, and then drill down into the profiles. One thing that's quite important to get right now, particularly for people who haven't touched any of this stuff, roles and profiles are just Puppet modules. They're not some special magic that Puppet Labs hid in Puppet. They don't actually exist until you write them. So there's nothing special about them. They are Puppet modules or Puppet classes that we've just chosen to call roles and profiles. And other people, I know a blog post that Gary Larissa wrote suggested that maybe it would be better if profiles were roles and roles were profiles. I like it that way. But no matter what you call them, they're nothing special. It's Puppet code, Puppet modules. So we're going to touch quickly on classification. So it sounds like a really fancy word, but all it really is in Puppet terms is Puppet deciding what classes to apply to a node. So there are various ways you can do that. You can do that within Puppet itself with SitePP. You can use a number of external tools. There's Enterprise Console if you're an enterprise customer, Foreman if you're open source. Puppet Dashboard, I keep hearing, yes, it's being supported, and then no, it isn't. Yes, it is. I think it's got community support. And actually, if you've got your own systems in place already, you can classify with your own custom script very easily. It plugs in super easy. So when we talk about roles and profiles, classification becomes just a matter of assigning one role to a node. So our Craig.PuppetLabs.dbm is a role ACME app. And that's all we're doing at classification. Any of your Bill, you wouldn't be doing it like that. You'd be doing it like that. But again, that's all Bill now has to do in order to spin up Puppet configuration on his infrastructure, is just tell Puppet what it should be. So yeah, we just classify the roles of the node. So the stack now, oops, pardon. So our classification component of our stack is only dealing with this business logic layer. It doesn't touch anything further down from that. So we've looked at resource modeling, we've looked at business logic, we've looked at how to implement all of these component modules, and we've looked at how to classify nodes. The other big thing you need to worry about is what to do with all your data. So there was a talk this morning, and somebody asked for a raise of hands who's not using Huayra, and people actually put their hands up. So if you're one of those people, you really, really, really want to be starting to use Huayra tomorrow, or you're going to break your data. So with data separation, we use parameterized classes, and we do that to take advantage of Huayra's data bindings, so we can automatically look values up from Huayra rather than having to hard code that in the module. And in this roles and profiles model, component modules and profiles can look up data from Huayra, but roles should not. Roles are only interested in just gathering profiles. So I think it's actually in the wrong place, but I put these slides in yesterday. So there was a guy called Laurent from D2SI did a talk in Paris this week, and his talk was very much around process and around DevOps and around collaboration. But he talked quite a bit about roles and profiles, and so much so I asked him if I could nick it. So he pointed out that actually when you're using roles and profiles, you're now making it easier for developers and operations to all collaborate on Puppet. So developers can actually focus on writing stuff they care about, like profiles for their apps, and operations can manage stuff about the infrastructure that they care about, and it's all pulled in with roles. So we start to have a stack that looks like this. So we can actually split up the profiles into business units if we want. And I've actually got Laurent's slide because his was far prettier than mine, but really similar. And I don't agree with everything he said. He said like ops should provide core OS modules, but then dev should like code a couple of them. I would say that would be up to your organization to assign the separation of duties there. But the point is you can have this model where with separation of duties, people can be both working and collaborating on Puppet. There's like a dependency cycle of credits in that slide. So having a look at the key benefits of what we've achieved, we've reduced this node level logic that we're assigning to a node. We've gained the ability to be massively flexible with implementation now, and that's going to solve a lot of edge cases. And the business logic improves manageability by non-Puppet users. If I want to go and tell Puppet that this server should be an ACME node, I shouldn't need to know a whole bunch of Puppet to be able to do that. And now I've exposed different functions within the Puppet infrastructure to a much wider scope of people. So I've used the words should and must, and this is how you do it quite a lot in this talk. This is more how I've done Puppet before, and it's how I would recommend people start using Puppet. But it's not the way to design Puppet. More importantly, it's a way to design Puppet. And this might not fit your organization perfectly, but it's more important to be thinking about how to design Puppet rather than not thinking about it at all. And I think it's a good thing to start with. I do get a couple of regular questions, which I'll run through. So people ask me quite a bit, well, that's cool, but like, can I do all this without roles? I think I've seen about 2 talks with people saying they are just using profiles and not using roles. And yeah, you can do whatever you want. So you can do that. I personally think that that layer of abstraction for the business logic is really important. But if you're happy to live without that, then don't. Also, can my role be defined in my ENC? So do I have to do this in code? Can I not just put all my role data in Enterprise Console or in the Foreman and do it that way? And again, you absolutely can. And I know lots of people who are doing that successfully. I like to keep it in code because saying what profiles are included in a role to me is kind of functionality. And I like to keep that stuff as much as possible in code so I can then version it. And then, can't I just use Huayra to define all these profiles? Yes and no. A lot of people are starting to go too far with Huayra and just turn their entire infrastructure into one giant YAML file and chuck it all at create resources. And I think that's losing the objective of why you installed Puppet in the first place. But But you can do that, but you lose the flexibility to implement code at the profiles layer. So you saw in my example, I was realizing a virtual user in my profile. I wouldn't better do that if I'm tied into Huayra. So the fundamental concepts, though, I think no matter which solution you use, are important. And that's abstraction. So it is all about abstraction, and the more you add these layers of abstraction in, the more flexibility you'll get, and the more edge cases you'll solve. Decoupling the business logic, the implementation, and the resource modeling, I think is really important. And separating data from code, so using Huayra. And by doing all of that put together, we're reducing our node level complexity. So we're making things easier to manage. So there are a couple of other resources on this. The bottom link here is a blog post I wrote a couple of years ago that got fairly popular on it. I personally think that Gary's rewrite quite recently is a lot better, and he explains things a lot better than I do. But they're definitely worth a look. So I think I've got good time for questions. Any questions? Nope. Oh, yep. Are you talking about run stages? Are you talking about run stages?
Yeah, testing, live.
Also, more environments. So it depends. So the difference normally between environments is going to be data. So that you would drive more from your hierarchy. So you don't really want to be having environmental stuff within roles and profiles, because that's the job of Huayra. So you should be able to have one role and a set of profiles for an application that is then configured differently in different environments depending on what answers Huayra gives. Yeah. Anyone else? Yep. So what we're trying to do, so the question was, what's the benefit of having the one-to-one relationship with between roles and nodes? And we're trying to reduce node level complexity. And at the top of the tree, I just want to say, this server is a thing. So it's an ACME server, it's a web server, it's a database server. At the top of the tree, I don't want to care about anything else. So we start having multiple roles assigned to servers, then it's like, well, this server's like a web server, and it's also a database server, and it's also this. So it's a different type of server, so it's a different thing. I know plenty of people who don't follow that rule. I like to adhere to it strictly. It's, again, a personal preference of how things fit within your infrastructure. But nobody else? Oh, yep. Sorry, it's a big view to look at. No, sorry.
When you define in your code, in your Puppet module, so that's a case where you say, okay, I must abstract my module from the scratch, and I mean, will I solve every problem with your role and profile model?
Will my roles and profiles module solve every problem?
So I think when I write a Puppet module and I keep my code to define, then I have to abstract from the new. Take a new model.
I think. Yeah, I'm actually trying to understand the question a little bit better. That's.
Oh, that's really super English, yeah. When I write a Puppet model, and in this module, I have the define.
I define a resource type.
Yeah,
okay.
define resource step. Then you preach us, I go back to the abstraction layer to.
What to use it? To declare it.
to make a new module.
So I think defined.
I define a wrong role.
So defined resource types are more about coming up with repeatable patterns to stamp out repeatable configuration. I don't know quite how that fits into the discussion of roles and profiles, or maybe I'm not understanding your question very well.
No, so we can discuss it later.
Yeah, by all means, come and find me later when we've got more time. Sorry I couldn't answer that one. Are we out of time?
No, you have 6 minutes.
Oh, right, we've got loads of time. Any, yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. So the question was, is having this roles to nodes one-to-one relationship making an ENC obsolete? No? So you're saying why in this model use the ENC at all if you're only using it to do that one thing? Totally, and you can totally use Huayra to do it. So you can use Huayra as an ENC as well. A lot of people have ENCs for like other functions like reporting and whatever, so they just tie it into there. I don't think it makes any difference whatsoever to the benefits you get out of the pattern, whether you put your classification in an ENC or in Huayra, if you're doing the one-to-one thing. So if that's easier, then yeah, you might be perfectly right. It might just make ENCs obsolete from the classification point of view. So. Uh-huh.
If we use the following approach, we will tell with Puppet 2.7 we have a huge problem with inner class dependencies where if class is dependent on other classes, sometimes the class dependencies get chunk isolates taken away from the main dependency tree and are self-sustained, so actions can be performed anytime. And with classes and rules, this actually explodes the problem.
Expose the problem?
No, I mean the problem gets.
So.
Well, if you or you have, for example, not every logic in your node or template class, for example. If you add another abstraction layer, this problem only becomes worse because you have more dependencies.
I'd say, like, Puppet's inherently not very good at intermodule dependencies. Like, there are lots of problems with it, and I think one of the best ways to solve that is to have an abstraction layer, because then you've got a little bit more flexibility over how you're implementing your components, and if you have dependency issues between them, that's actually the perfect place to fix them, rather than having to go and hack the modules to talk to each other. So
you mean it's better to expose also dependency logic into the roles classes?
So there's two arguments to this. So modules should be able to deal with their own dependencies. But in the real world and with things like Forge and people picking and choosing different modules to do different things, it doesn't work very well at the moment. So I'd like to see either that gets improved or people start doing that in profiles. Does that make sense?
Not really, so the main problem here is basically you have a base class that is installing repository definitions.
Okay.
Your models and roles, and then install software from those repositories. You run into problems with repositories not being available for the models, unless you do some fancy magic with dependencies.
I identified the problem, but I think that problem's more to do with individual modules and how they're written. And without roles and profiles, you can't really fix that. Or you can fix the modules, but you have to go and drill down and hack the modules to work. And the way I say it, any kind of dependency problem between modules is, if there are problems with dependencies, then profiles is the ideal place to fix it. But do that. Into the profile. Yeah.